In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Hello everyone. On behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger, welcome to the livecast about emerging stories. My name is Rut Kronenburg and I'm your host of today. This is the 16th edition of Emerging Stories, the talk show about the future and importance of independent journalism. Especially during these very uncertain and sometimes crazy times, access to reliable information is even more important than ever. In this series, we're going to dive into the different aspects of journalism. We're going to touch upon the problems and we try to come up with solutions. We do that with international guests, photographers, media experts, journalists, scientists, and they will share with us their emerging stories and the future of independent journalism. One of the things that has an enormous impact on the future of journalism is, of course, the development of online news and the increase of fake news that came with it. That raises the following question for us. How does fake news or news influence the public opinion? And I'm very proud that we're going to explore this topic today with the guest of today. In the studio, we have Mrs. Daan Rovers. She's Thinker Laureate of the Netherlands. And via Zoom, we have with us Mr. David Kaye, former Special Rapporteur of the UN on freedom of expression. Mr. David Kaye, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Midway, we'll have an intermezzo, and then we're going to talk with photographer and documentary videographer Cynthia Matonotze. That's Midway. But first, Daan. You're Thinker Laureate of the Netherlands. What does that mean?
Well, that's kind of like the Poet Laureate. That's a more normal title, I think, in some countries.
And more well-known in the Netherlands?
Yes. The Thinker Laureate is a philosopher in the Netherlands who is... well, let's say what I'm doing. It's only one person in the 2 years, and I'm trying to... show the beauty, the urgence, the meaning of philosophy and critical thinking in these challenging times, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and especially nowadays, critical thinking is more important than ever. And what are your current, are you doing something, you're about to make a research, I heard?
I'm teaching at the university, and I'm researching some subjects on public opinion, but I'm also writing essays and articles for newspapers on the pandemic, on racism, on the meritocracy, on the meaning of work. So I have a whole scale of subjects.
Very interesting. And you know actually David Kaye, right?
Yes, we met once, yeah.
David, you've been a special rapporteur for the UN for 6 years. And it was until July of this year. What are the most important takeaways of those 6 years?
Well, that's a big question. And I guess, what I'd like to do is connect a big takeaway to what Daan just said and to your response to it. One takeaway is that a combination of both governmental repression worldwide and social media dominance has really interfered with the ability of the public to engage in basic critical thinking. And I think we see this in all sorts of ways. We see law being reformulated so that journalism is a crime. We see social media and other parts of the technological sector having this enormous power that is not democratic. And I think there's a kind of fundamental public confusion and uncertainty about how to treat big issues of the public interest right now. And that would be one big takeaway from the last several years.
And would you agree then with Dan that people should actually be more critical on the things and on the news that they consume?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that we're in a way being disabled from critical thinking, in part because we don't always have the tools to even distinguish truth from falsity, to understand what is factual today. And that's, in part because, people in public space, especially, public actors, people in the kind of the Donald Trump mold, are very happy to have an environment of confusion. And we need to be resilient. And I guess one of my concerns is that our institutions, whether they're educational institutions or political institutions, they're not really showing a real resilience in the moment. And that's, I think, where we need to be focusing a lot of our attention. How do we create resiliency in the face of all of this effort to undermine our ability to engage in critical thinking?
And is that something that you witness in the US especially, or is that a trend around the world?
I think it's a worldwide trend. Certainly in the United States, we see it in the United States in some ways. The ability to see it is more stark, as it is in Europe, because you do have institutions of independent media. You do have institutions of freedom of expression, and yet even in those situations, even in these environments, you have real problems of critical thinking and institutions of critical thinking. And that's very different from the places around the world where we have very serious repression, governmental repression, where government is aiming towards undermining critical thinking in a kind of a legal way. So yes, it's a problem everywhere. It's a worldwide trend, I think.
Dan, is that also something that you experience here in the Netherlands?
Yes, of course. I think America is one step beyond. And I think America is first, and then we are following with these trends, I think. And but we have to specify what do we mean by critical thinking, because critical thinking is thinking for yourself, but it's not the same as not trusting nobody.
Right.
That's another thing.
Yes.
Critical thinking means to discern what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. And I see people now think that critical thinking is saying no to everyone, saying no to mainstream media, saying no to political leaders. But that's always saying no. It's not the same as being critical. Critical thinking is having your own compass to decide what you follow and what not, but not saying no to everyone and create your own new herd of people saying no to everyone.
Actually, this is a great bridge to the video we want to share, because we actually wanted to know what the people on the street are thinking about this. So our flying reporter went to the streets and asked passers-by the following question. We receive a lot of news and information via various media, being television, radio, mobile, internet, the newspaper. How do you know when it's reliable and when not? Let's have a look.
Ik heb het idee dat je heel moeilijk kan weten of iets echt is of niet. Wat ik eigenlijk doe is kijken op de sites van NOS of AD zelf. En alles wat op Facebook of social media staat, dat ga ik eigenlijk vanuit dat dat niet echt kan zijn. Dus of je het dan weet of niet, maar meestal als er wat staat, dan denk ik vaak al van eerst wat op NOS staat, dat vertrouw ik dan meestal wel. Maar verder kijk ik ook niet zoveel.
Ik doe dat zelf voornamelijk door heel veel nieuws te kijken, ook van verschillende instanties. En dan kijken of het een beetje op elkaar aansluit. En op het moment dat je merkt dat er veel verschillende berichten komen, dan weet je dat er iets niet klopt. Dus dan ga je je verder verdiepen, ga je nog verder op internet lezen of dan ga je nog verder naar de nieuwsberichten luisteren. Dus een beetje zelf op onderzoek uitgaan.
Dat is heel lastig. Dat is op een gegeven moment een beetje de bronnen kennen, gezond verstand gebruiken en meerdere bronnen vergelijken met elkaar, denk ik. En helemaal zeker weten doe je het nooit.
Ik zoek dat op met andere middelen dan alleen maar de informatie die ik binnenkrijg via de media. En ik volg dat bij andere mensen.
Nou, ik kijk vooral uit welke bron, zeg maar wat voor bron het is. En dan kijk ik of ik die betrouwbaar vind of andere mensen die betrouwbaar vinden. En dan kijk ik zo of ik het ook betrouwbaar vind.
Ik denk dat ik ook ander nieuws lees waar vergelijkbare informatie is. Dan weet je het alleen maar. Als het vaker voorkomt via allerlei andere media, dan heb ik wel het gevoel van, het is wel waar. Kijk, als de een dit zegt en de ander dat, dan ga je er aan twijfelen. En ik lees ook van alles, allerlei soorten kranten, digitaal krijg ik die. Dus, ik heb wel het gevoel, niet dat alles waar is, maar wel als het vaker voorkomt dat het wel een soort van betrouwbaar is. En dan haal ik natuurlijk ook met mijn gezonde verstand het een en ander uit. Maar ja, af en toe zal je ook wel nepnieuws krijgen. Dat
David, so it seems that the Dutch people, of course this is just a snapshot, but that they are kind of critical. Would you actually get the same reactions when you do this in America?
It's a really great question. I don't know, but as I was listening, I was thinking, gosh, I want to live in the Netherlands again. One of the things that was inspiring about those answers was that each of the interviewees there, who I imagine your man on the street or woman on the street just sort of caught unawares, they were responding in a way that I think good critical thinking education, good media literacy would encourage you to respond with. They were saying, look, I don't take everything as true, although I am, if it's the public broadcaster, I'm a little bit more willing to accept it as true, which was very interesting and I think very heartening for those who believe in public media. But they're looking at different sources. Where is the source from? How do they evaluate different sources? I thought that was really quite brilliant. And it might be that when you go to different environments around the world, that you'll get that same kind of answer. But I do think that there's still this overarching problem of governments that are creating and trying to create very significant space for doubt. And that feeds into their own political interest in retaining or gaining power. And so I think we need to be alive to that. And I still think that we need people to be educated, really, to use the tools that your interviewees just now suggested, because to me that sounds like a pretty media literate environment.
I agree. Dan, what's your point of view of this when you see these people?
Yes, I agree with David. They were very well formulated criteria.
But they were random passers-by.
Well, that's very good for the view of Amsterdam and the citizens, I think. But what David said about this education of media education we need, it's very important, but we only have people in schools till they're 18 years or 20 years or 25 years old. And then they have years to decades to go and are not educated anymore in this new media environment. How do we educate people with these new social media?
You mean the people who already left
information?
Schools?
Yeah. That's hard to establish, I think.
Right, that could be absolutely. Is that also something in the United States that you see that older people actually are lacking a kind of media literacy?
I think that's right. I think the way Don puts it is exactly right. I think on the one hand, it may be that younger people who are kind of growing up in an environment where they may be almost naturally predisposed towards doubt, because everything that they read, everything that they hear is framed as, well, this may not be true, or there's a deep fake, this could be faked, this could be fake news, this could be a fake video, whatever it might be. They're being kind of acculturated to that kind of environment. And so they may be more willing to be critical and to use their own skills at sifting out truth from fact and making their own determination. But I totally agree with Don that the education can't just stop when people leave. And because the media environment is changing, it's evolving so quickly, I do think we need to have tools for education beyond one's formal education. And that is, I think that is a bit of a kind of public policy trick for us. It's something that we need to be considering. How do we promote that kind of media literacy well beyond one's formal education?
How do you think that the news nowadays influence the public opinion?
Well, enormously. It's interesting. I'm writing a book on Walter Lippmann. He wrote a book, Public Opinion, a century ago, 100 years ago. And his question was, well, now we have democracy. This is the most important political system we have. If we are serious with this democracy, if we want to have it work, if we want to have a self-governing community, then we have to pay attention to public opinion, because that's the only force that's legitimate. And how can we influence public opinion? How can we have good fundament for this opinion? Well, it's only by information. And why do we? How can public opinion be established on good information? Not only by education, because you say goodbye to school at your 20s. So we need to have public institutions, we need to have journalism, and we need to have, well, he said some environment like moral educations, churches or something like that. But all these institutions nowadays are not trusted anymore, even journalism. So everything is on the... everything is
question.
Yeah, it's questioned. It's distrusted. So these institutions have no power anymore, and then public opinion is going everywhere.
And what about the social media? I think they have an enormous influence on the public opinion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just for you to know, David, our king was supposed to have his holiday in Greece. But due to the public opinion, I mean, there was an outrage on Twitter and social media about the fact that he went to Greece while we here in the Netherlands are actually summoned to stay at home as much as possible. So under the force of the public opinion...
Before he landed,
he decided to go back. So the influence of social media is, I would say, enormous.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that?
Two things. First, on the king's vacation, I'm sorry about that. What I wonder, though, is, public opinion and public outrage existed before social media. So, I don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that social media is responsible for everything. I mean, we did have public concern, public outrage before it was articulated in different ways, and it's a useful, however the public opinion is articulated, it's a useful check on public leaders. It's a useful check on people who might be spending public funds, and I don't want to overstate social media's role, or at least the difference that might be, because it may be that the difference isn't necessarily huge. But on one of the points that Don made, I just want to amplify this. On the distrust, I agree, is very significant right now, and I think that there is a role as we think about I think we should be thinking about investment. It isn't that social media is somehow going to change on its own. It's not as if the mainstream broadcast media will simply change on its own. There needs to be investment by the government, both on the regulatory side, for example, to create transparency so we understand what the social media companies are actually doing. But there also needs to be investment in public media and a reinforcement of it, which it's extremely politicized in the United States to our detriment. And we need investment in that. We need investment in independent media at local levels. I think that kind of investment, which unfortunately, I mean, especially in the United States, I think it's a bit different in Europe where you have such strong feelings for public media services. But in the United States, we really need that kind of rethink about how we can use public funds to reinforce and regain trust in different kinds of public institutions, whether it's the media or government or even social media.
But do you think then that social media has become too much of a free haven nowadays?
Well, it's been, I don't know if I would say too much. It's clear that social media is, I don't really like the term, but it's been weaponized by different bad actors. And I go back to the word used earlier of resilience. And I'm afraid that in part because there's so much distrust in public institutions, including, as Don said, in the media, that the normal kind of resilience doesn't exist there. And so clearly things need to change with social media, and we could talk about what that might be. But it's not only a social media problem, and it's not as if there's one kind of silver bullet or single answer or single policy that's going to solve this real enormous problem of information in the public interest.
But I mean, the fact that there is not a real regulation on the internet means that the social platforms do it themselves. We have a video of one of them. Let's have a look.
We build a platform that's used for a lot of good all around the world, but there will always be bad actors.
Facebook has a much larger effect on our democracy than most of us would have expected.
I think both parties are going to recognize that these platforms are very different than they were 10 years ago.
This was made clear in the 2016 presidential election.
We went and told everybody we could find in the middle of the summer the Russians were messing with the election, and we were basically shooed away.
There was a failure of the imagination in terms of thinking about the way that this platform, which, has its arms around the world, could be exploited.
The company has attempted to better position itself for the 2020 election, especially with a pandemic that pushed social media usage up 61% in April of 2020. But experts question the efficiency of its new strategy.
They seem to be addressing the threat of 2016 as opposed to the threat of 2020.
And while Facebook is a catalyst for election manipulation, it's only part of a larger picture.
The media loves to hit on Facebook and has done very little to look at itself.
As the U.S. heads into the 2020 election cycle, what challenges does Facebook face, and what measures can Facebook take to stop the spread of disinformation and fake news around candidates and voting security?
We're hoping to help inoculate public debate and protect against some of the disinformation we'll see coming.
Dan, what is your opinion about this?
Well, I'm a bit mixed. I'm happy to see this, but also I'm a bit skeptic because I doubt whether Facebook is taking a normative stance or it's a kind of opportunistic way of doing and way of avoiding claims of being challenged with posting fake news and so on. And when they
being one of the drivers of fake news, you
yes,
mean? Yeah.
and then they have to be transparent on their algorithms, and that's what they fear most. So they are taking a giant leap to avoid that and to be very secure and say, well, then we don't post political advertisement. But okay, it's better than spreading fake news.
Is that also your opinion, David?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not sure I would say opportunistic as much as I would say that although I think that's part of it, I think that the companies, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and others, they have a business model. And their business model is essentially it's to sell ads, and it's to sell engagement with those ads. And anything that interferes with that is seen as a business problem. In other words, it's not as if these companies are designed or even set up to deal with the public interest impact that they have. And I think that that's not going to change, except perhaps on the margins, without either public pressure or ultimately public regulation. And it's not going to work if it's only public regulation around, say, political advertising, because the way people share information, they're sharing all sorts of memes, of stories that have nothing to do with the political ads. And it's that sharing that can be, on the one hand, it's within an individual's right to share. It's a freedom of expression principle. But at the same time, the companies have these tools of making that sharing go viral. And they need to be checking that. I mean, it raises a whole number of questions, but I think fundamentally, the companies are not designed to integrate the public interest, and it's up to the public to make sure that they are sort of regulated in that way.
Okay, but apparently they are feeling the pressure of the public. Yeah. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come to this decision, right? So there is a kind of... I think the public pressure then actually have influence also on these social media platforms.
I totally agree with that. It actually, in some ways, goes back to Don's mention of Walter Lippmann. I mean, we do see the power of public opinion, but what we don't see is, which I think is really ultimately necessary, is a kind of regulatory framework in which we return to a kind of democratic control over sources of information. And that doesn't mean, to my mind, control over the content, but it does mean control over the disclosure, the transparency, the understanding of what's happening on these platforms. Because I think of this as a question of these companies having such massive impact on public space, and yet the public having ultimately very little control over how they're operating and how they operate. So I think we need to turn to that conversation. I mean, not necessarily here, but I mean the public conversation needs to turn not just to how do different public interests and how does public opinion in a kind of happenstance way or according to the fad or the moment, how does it work? But how do we think about these platforms in a broader perspective of how they should fit into democratic society, how they should fit into a time when, we need sources of information that we, using our critical thinking skills, can evaluate that works for democracy and doesn't work against it.
Dan, do you also want to comment on that?
Yes, because in essence, these platforms have a very emancipatory power.
Absolutely.
Because everyone with Wi-Fi can express his or her opinion on a platform. That's enormously, but we are not used to these new forces, I think. So we're not having a public conversation anymore between 5 or 6 or 7 powerful people, scientists, politicians, but we're having a public conversation with everywhere on the world on every subject. That's very emancipatory and that's very good. But now it's controlled by very strong economic powers, not public powers, but economic powers. And these are designed to grab your attention, to sell advertisements. And that's not in the interest of the public or of the political sphere.
And democracy, I would say.
And democracy.
Okay, so internet and social media actually doesn't necessarily benefit journalism. We're going to talk about that a bit later. We now have first an intermezzo with our guest coming from Zimbabwe, Cynthia Motonotse. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Ruth. Hi, everyone.
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you guys?
We're doing okay here. I know we're in a bit colder situation than you are because it's very hot in Harare.
Yes, it's very hot.
Cynthia, you're an independent documentary photographer, sometimes a photojournalist and a videographer, and based, of course, in Harare. And your work since the beginning of 2012 has been on social issues mostly, right?
Yes.
Yes. And your work has been published in multiple mainstream international media, I would say.
Yes, definitely.
What are you currently working on?
Currently, I'm working on the rights of people who live in communities where extractive industries work. So this is something that is still in its inception. But I'm hoping that with restrictions easing around the country, I'll be able to visit some of these communities and really start the groundwork.
Because you're in a lockdown due to Corona?
Yes, we are in a partial lockdown, actually. People are allowed to move around, but it's a little limited.
Okay. So what is the situation when it comes to the pandemic in Harare or Zimbabwe?
When it comes to the pandemic in Zimbabwe, the numbers are pretty low. We are at 8,000 reported official cases. And when it comes to the lockdown, we are in a partial lockdown where people are allowed to go to work and move from city to city. But there is a curfew, which I believe is 10 p.m. So everyone should be in their homes by 10 p.m.
So, and are there restaurants and shops closed, or is that not the case?
Restaurants and shops are open, but again, up to a certain time. When it comes to grocery shops, particularly by 8, everyone should be closed.
Okay. And when you mention 8,000 cases, which is actually low, is that infected cases? Is that what you mean?
Yes, 8,000 infected active cases.
Okay. And what about the death rate? Can you mention something about that?
I think the last I checked, the death rate was at 386, I believe, which is quite low.
Is that since the outbreak?
Yes, since the outbreak.
Yeah. Okay. You made for us some pictures. We're going to have a look at it. And can you please share with us why you took these pictures? What are we looking at?
You're looking at objects belonging to people that are Zimbabweans that worked outside of Zimbabwe, and in the advent of COVID-19, they found themselves unemployed. So most of them had to make the hard decision of coming back to Zimbabwe. So these objects that I photographed are the things that helped them survive that journey in a particularly difficult situation. So what I mean by that is that with most of us, I believe, when we go through difficult times, there's always something that we reach for, whether it's another human being, the Bible, anything that would help us get through. So for these particular individuals, these are the objects that they found themselves holding on to. So for one person, it was their diary where they would write daily about the things that they were grateful for that would help them go through the difficult time that they were facing. For another person, it was a rainbow scarf that would remind them, in the words of the person, that whenever there's rain, there's always a rainbow. So for each individual, each object helps them go through the time of leaving their life from the country that they lived in to coming back home and starting a new life in a sort of new normal because of the pandemic. So the reason I chose to photograph their objects rather than them is because, like Dan had mentioned, that journalism or journalists sometimes become the object of mistrust. So when you approach someone and you explain, this is what I want to do, is it okay if I photograph you, or is it okay if I record your story? Most times I found that you are met with distrust. So in this particular story, I was met with a little distrust because of the pandemic. There was so much information and misinformation going around, which created stigma towards the people that were leaving the countries that they lived in to come back home. So the stigma was around them bringing COVID to Zimbabwe. So it became that a lot of the times when the numbers were reported, it would break down which group of people were most infected. And in most cases, it was they were termed the returnees, the ones that were coming from outside the country. So at some point, it started to become almost like they were bringing COVID into Zimbabwe. So I decided to photograph their objects in the hope of humanizing them, that maybe if you look or see an object, you can relate. Like if you see somebody's cell phone and most of their downloads had something to do with religion, you can relate and say, okay, yeah, this is something I do as well, so as to take away the stigma.
Right.
If I had photographed them physically to show them a portrait or anything like that, for them, firstly, they wouldn't be comfortable with it. And secondly, even if I had succeeded, it would almost be as if I'm fueling the stigma to say,
emphasizing
these are the
on it.
returnees and these are the people that are bringing COVID.
Right.
So I decided to photograph more around the objects that
instead
help
of
them through.
the people themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. So can you also explain why the dress? I'm curious about it. Why the dress?
So the dress, the lady I spoke to, so it was her very first time leaving Zimbabwe to go to another country to work. So when she lost her job and she had to return, the only thing that she managed to purchase with the money that she had been earning for 3 months was a dress. So for her, she said that it's a reminder that of the things that I went through when I was there, firstly, and a reminder for me to always give myself a chance, especially when it comes to giving myself a chance at education. Because the reason she left Zimbabwe in the first place is that she hadn't passed her O-levels well. And in her own words, she was sort of playing with school and education. So when she came back with that dress, it's a symbol of her choices, her previous choices that she made, and a symbol to always remind her that she needs to give herself a chance so that she can have better opportunities in the future.
Yeah, wonderful.
So I just photographed her dress.
Yeah. Incredible. So, last question for you: what does, to your opinion, looks the future of photography or photojournalism look like in Zimbabwe and in Africa, maybe as a whole?
I think, for me, the future looks hopeful. I say this looking at what photography has done as a whole for this critical time that we find ourselves in. There is certain information that we wouldn't have had it not been in a photograph. So I feel that the future of photography is bright. I think it's bright for those that know how to innovate, so know how to adapt to the time. I remember there was a photograph that made it to the front page of the New York magazine, which was shot remotely. So the photographer wasn't anywhere near the person that they photographed. They photographed it over Zoom, and it was the cover. So there will always be a need for photography, and there will always be a space for photography. I think it is up to us, the photographers, to innovate and to give ourselves a space in the world of information, because photography is always something that we will need. Looking at the End SARS protest in Nigeria, we're getting a lot of information on that protest because of the photographers, the independent photographers that are on the streets day and night that are photographing this protest.
We
and
actually had a photographer last week in our midst from Nigeria. Yes. And a picture always says more than words actually can do. So
yes, it does.
Thank you very, very much for sharing these pictures with us, Cynthia. It was delightful to have you in our live cast. Thank you, and all the best for the near future for you.
Thank you very much.
Having said that, the picture says more than words. You also brought a cartoon with us that is also very powerful. Maybe we can have a look at that, the cartoon. So, Dan, why this cartoon?
Yes, it's quite well known. It says it all. The journalists are in the middle of the picture, but Trump is throwing his ball via social media directly to the audience. He doesn't need the journalists anymore, and the people in their rooms don't need the media as well. They are outplayed in this cartoon, and yeah.
Is that also some of the problems, actually, that the mainstream media doesn't know how to reach the audience anymore?
I think the impact of the mainstream media is becoming less, yes. And it's not a very optimistic message, but we have to face it, because young people aren't going to watch television as older people do, just set it on at 8 o'clock watching the news. That's not how it works anymore. No. So you grab the news from internet, from social media, from your phone. A lot of people don't pay for the news anymore. That's actually a complaint that Walter Lippmann 100 years ago had. He said, well, people expect to have the news delivered on their doormat for $1. That's the price for a bag of licorice. So that's too cheap. And now we expect it to be free. So that's a very problematic situation. That's one thing. We want it for free, and we don't consume it that regularly anymore. And the other problem is it's not trusted anymore. That's a kind of harder problem, because how can you gain your trust again? How do you do that?
As a journalist,
as a media company. Right. That's very, and even in this pandemic, it's becoming worse.
But at the same time, because of this pandemic, you see that the people actually turn to the media again, because they are hungry for the information about COVID-19, everything that they can read about it, they are consuming or watching. So there is still a role for the media. What do you think, David?
Yeah, on the one hand, like that cartoon does capture Trump's approach to avoid journalists, but I don't want to overstate it. And this might be particularly an American problem, but I don't think it is. And I think it's that social media actually interacts quite closely with parts of the traditional media. And in the United States, and you see this in other places where the Murdoch empire is particularly effective, in the United States, Fox News has an extraordinary role to play in disseminating disinformation or disseminating distrust in public institutions. And I think that picture of the football being tossed over journalists is part of the problem, but it's not the full picture. The full picture involves a kind of, it's almost more like a hot potato. There's a kind of tossing between social media and Fox News and maybe other news outlets. There's also Breitbart and other figures out there who are very involved in sharing disinformation. And I think that kind of understanding of how these different factors interact is actually quite important. And at the same time, it, I think, reinforces the importance of providing more support to public information, to public media sources, real sources of hard-hitting investigative journalism, but journalism that is also in the public interest that so often the politicians want to avoid entirely.
But still, do you think that how can journalists, mainstream media, tackle this problem? I mean, just giving their information to the public seems not to be enough.
Well, I think there has been, in many, many places around the world, an effort by journalists, on the one hand, to do real strong investigative journalism. So, like, on the one hand, while it's clear that people like Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Orban in Hungary or many places around the world, that you have politicians pushing disinformation and pushing a kind of the media as the enemy kind of approach. At the same time, you've had an extraordinary amount of excellent investigative journalism, documentaries, photography, other sources that have been really excellent over the last 5 to 10 years, and perhaps especially over the last 3 or 4 years. The problem is that journalists need the support of a kind of economy that supports them, right? They need it because, as Don was suggesting, people expect their media to be free now. It's undermining the ability of journalists to actually survive and to have the resources to do that kind of difficult investigative journalism. So there needs to be public support for that. There needs to be, social media needs to pay for the media that it is disseminating. Many issues there.
Right. So actually the money has to come from the social platforms themselves. Like Australia actually started to look into the situation that they want Facebook, Twitter, etc. to pay for news, right? Is that a good trend, you would say?
Well, I'm a bit skeptic because if they have to pay for news, they don't disseminate the news anymore. So there was a very interesting proposal by I thought a French minister to let Facebook and YouTube and all these platforms pay by attention time. So the clicker is rolling when I open my Facebook, and when I spend that 10 minutes of time, Facebook has to pay 10 cents for my time to the public institutions, because that's their business model, grabbing my attention and keeping my attention. So if they are paid by all the attention they get, they have a fair amount of tax.
Okay, but it's not sad that money goes to the media, to the independent journalism.
Goes to the I think politics has to see that the media are kind of vital, key infrastructure in society, just like highways. It's just like physical infrastructure, just like education. So they have to be paid very well because it's the fundament of our democracy, I think.
Absolutely. And the media cannot only thrive on investigations, right? And investigations cost time, and time is money again. So, I mean, this is a kind of a dilemma for the media. So it's not so easy to solve this. Do you have?
It's definitely no. It's definitely. Okay. And I love what Don just said. I mean, I do think we should be. Am I back? I know sometimes we live Zoom. Sometimes
there was just a short amount.
What I was saying was, I really agree with Don's point that we do need to conceptualize the media as a public service, not as a utility. And I don't think we want to take this too far, but I do think we need to think of the media, certainly public media, as something that we should be supporting as a public. through our democratic processes, much as we think of roads and highways being essential to our economy, we need an independent media, and a media that provides ample information to voters as also being fundamental to our democracy.
So that means actually the governments have to pay for it, right?
Yeah. And the social...
I think so.
And the case in the Netherlands, the government pays for the public media.
Yeah, there is a public media infrastructure in the Netherlands, yes.
Yeah, and there's also the case in the US, or less?
Well, we do have it. We have public broadcasting, we have national public radio. They're both excellent, but and I don't know if this is true in the Netherlands as well, but they're highly politicized here, and they haven't been valued in the same way that public media has been valued in the Netherlands or in other places in Europe or the UK. I mean, we actually see in the UK that the BBC is under threat from politicians. So, I think this is a space that constantly needs nurturing.
And do you think that the UN actually can play a role in this? Forcing upon people and countries to actually set up systems for this?
I think the UN can be very helpful in kind of providing for states that don't have public media a kind of set of best practices, examples of how public support, and by public support we do mean taxation, that goes to supporting those kinds of public service media. I think the UN can play a helpful role there, and also reinforcing the normative framework that an independent media is indeed a part of the freedom of expression. It's a part of democracy. It's not just a kind of luxury that wealthy countries should enjoy. It is, as Don said, it's fundamental.
Dan, what's your takeaway from this? Who can help us to make the world a bit better in this way?
Well, I think we should stress tax regulation on the social media platforms. There's so lot of amounts of money, so we have to take a lot of taxes from them. Then politics should redistribute it on the media. But I think journalists themselves have to maybe innovate a little and grab the attention from the public, because they have to, invest in new forms of storytelling or be pluralistic, because still they have to grab the attention of the audience, because there can be public media services, but if everyone's still on Facebook reading crap, then
it doesn't help.
It doesn't help. So
yes,
they have to be inventive, innovative, and invest in storytelling, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. David, you too?
Yes, I completely agree with that.
So last week we actually talked about how robotism actually can help journalists. So that was also one of the aspects, and new business models as well. But bottom line, journalists need to reinvent their business models and look for their audiences, how they can actually re-engage with their audience. Do you have a suggestion?
That's true.
Yeah.
And one thing I think is useful to put in context is that the model for the media to survive has been changing for years. It isn't only social media. It's a broader question, I think, that we've been talking about. It's a broader question of how society values the media. And social media has accelerated some of the problems, but many of these issues pre-existed social media. And I think we do need to get back to basics in terms of reinforcing how important independent media is for democratic processes, for voters, and so forth. And it'll be solved in part by solving the social media problem, but that'll be necessary, but that's not sufficient to address the overarching problems that we're talking about here.
And do you have an example of where it actually goes right at the moment? Are there silver lines for us to look at?
I think, well, honestly, I was inspired by the interviewees that you showed early in the program. I mean, I don't know if that says, if that's representative of only Amsterdam or across the Netherlands, but I do think that those kinds of responses are inspiring to me. And I think that if we can somehow almost, bottle that kind of energy and that kind of response and share that with people around the world, I think people will say, that's how I would like media in my country to be. And I think I think you should be proud as a Dutch broadcaster to hear those kinds of answers, honestly, because I don't think you'd hear that everywhere around the world or in every environment, even in the Netherlands probably. But I do think that if we can kind of use that as an instance of what we're aiming towards, I think that's a good model.
Thank you. Dan, do you agree?
Yes, I do. And can I give an example?
Yes,
because
please.
Yesterday's evening there was a program on the television, Zondag met Lubach. You don't know it, David, I suppose, but it's from a public broadcasting company, and it's a mix of news and humor. And there are 2 million viewers, I think. And
it's very popular in the Netherlands.
Popular. And he explained quite good and quickly how the rabbit hole on YouTube worked.
Absolutely.
So 2 million people know now. I don't know if it changes the world, but they are very very well informed about the strategy and the algorithms of YouTube.
And the pitfall of social media.
Yeah.
Right, yes.
Very informative and very funny. My children were laughing out loud.
Yeah.
I think that is a good example. And I would say that the importance of humor, we've seen in the United States, we have John Oliver, or before him, Jon Stewart. There's a certain power of humor in reaching people, and particularly humor that is infused with a kind of smart ability to describe and explain. But I think that is a really good example of how moving forward we can think about using those tools to educate people about both the importance of independent media, but also about how algorithms work, how social media works, how we are being presented with information, manipulated, and so forth.
Totally agree. I'm sorry that we're already come to the end of the live cast. But before we go, I have one final question for the both of you, because every week I ask my guests the same question, and that is, what does the media landscape look like in 30 years? So in 2050. Dan, do you have any idea?
I just read a novel on science fiction. There was a great novel, and it described the media landscape. It's not very optimistic, but as seeing the world only by your preferences. So seeing a very happy, nice world, because you don't look at these films on war, corona, poor people. So
refugees, migrants.
Turning to media will mean turning to a wellness zone.
Being in your own bubble.
Yeah.
Okay. David?
Sorry.
I think that's absolutely a possible outcome. I don't want to go down. I could go down a kind of dystopic description of what the world might look like. I want to go for more the hopeful side, that maybe over the last 3 or 4 years, at least in the United States, we've been woken up from a kind of slumber, and we change our attitude towards public support for the media. We have a strong public broadcasting, and we have individuals who are really able to critically assess information in their own decision making about how to engage in the public. That's what I hope we are aiming towards. And 30 years from now, I hope that's where we are. And I think we need to be optimistic. Otherwise, we would all just give up.
Yeah,
I place my bet on your view, David.
So
Forget
both
mine.
media and the people are more resilient. Let's end with that. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. David Kay, special guest, and Daan Rovers, also a special guest. Thank you very much. Thank you, the viewers, of course, for watching us. This was the 16th episode of Emerging Stories, the talk show about the future of journalism. Next week, we will be back with a new episode, and then we're going to talk about how journalists can build on online communities. So I hope you will be with us then again. For now, thank you for watching and have a very good evening. Thank you.